Topic 12. Did Rome fall? Well, before we get to this question of whether or not Rome fell, I'd like you to have some things running in your head as we pursue this final topic. And I'd like you to go back to our first topic together when I asked you, when I think of ancient Rome, I think ... And I said, what nouns and verbs and images come to mind? And I suggested that at the end, and here we are, that you revisit those preconceptions, nouns, verbs, images, and ask yourself, what do I know now that I didn't know 12 segments ago? What preconceptions changed? What didn't? Why or why not? And I also want you to think forward, because I don't think that this course is over when we're done in a few minutes. I think that this course will be over when you go and see a museum, or go to Europe and see an aqueduct or a ruin, see a sculpture, read an historical novel, see a series on TV or a documentary, and make a connection between this course and that moment or that object. And when the ding goes off in your head, I'm going to suggest that that's where the course really ends, because it's when you own that material. Another way of doing that is to say, what are the 3 things I'd like to tell somebody about what I learned in this course? And I do hope you did learn some things with me. So, did Rome fall? Are we at the end of the story, or are we just at a new beginning? Well, let's bring ourselves up to speed. Let's remember Diocletian thought that the empire was getting way too big. So he took those 40 provinces and he turned them into 105, but he grouped the 105 provinces under 12 dioceses, and each of them was led by a vicar. And already you should begin to hear in the back of your head a transition into medieval Christianity, because those are words that are used, diocese and vicar. And we've already seen in the last topic that Christianity now being endowed with power and wealth, that's a good thing and that's a bad thing, and that's going to push us forward into the Middle Ages. So not only does Constantine win the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and over time seem to say, yes, that it was the sun god, S-O-N, more than the sun god, S-U-N, at least in his coins, but he then decides, you know, he was always much more interested in the eastern part of the empire than in the western part. Diocletian split the empire in 293, and Constantine decides, oh, the weather's much nicer over there. So he goes to a little village, kind of a small city called Byzantium, and he just builds it up, and he's very humble, so he names it after himself, Constantinople, which is really nothing other than the polis of Constantine. Constantinople. And he declares that it's the Nova Roma, the new Rome, in the year 330. One of the other interesting things is that now that he's more Christian, or certainly his mother is Christian, she says, hey, we need to go further. We need to go to Palestina, and we need to endow the holy places there. And in fact, it's under Helen or Helena, who allegedly finds the true cross, that Jerusalem is built up into a circuit of buildings that becomes a pilgrimage center starting in the 330s. So the impact of Constantine and his mother is huge, not only in the west, but also in the east, the Near East, if you will, of Turkey and Constantinople, and the Middle East, what we today call the modern Middle East of the Holy Land. So there's an impact there. And the kind of architecture that you see in the Holy Land is a mix of Western and Eastern architecture, what we sometimes call Byzantine architecture. And Constantinople becomes the center of the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire. In fact, there will be an emperor in Constantinople claiming to be the heir of Rome and the Roman emperor until 1453. Yes, 1453, the end of the Middle Ages. In fact, some people say the Middle Ages ends in 1453 when Constantinople finally falls to the Turks. And that emperor in Constantinople becomes very important to the West because, for instance, when one of them writes a letter to the Pope, Urban II, in the 1090s, one of the things he says is, help, I need your protection. The Muslims are at my gates, and that's one of the reasons why Pope Urban II in 1095 calls the First Crusade. So Constantinople is a bit of a connective tissue. What's going on in the West? Well, let's use this word barbarians. Now, barbarians is a loaded term. I grew up in New York, and to Mets fans, Yankee fans are barbarians, and to Yankee fans, Mets fans are barbarians. Barbarians is nothing other than the oldest way of distinguishing between us and them. And us is always good, and them is always bad. Us and them, ethnically, religiously, every culture says, oh, listen to those people, they speak blah, 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 because they don't speak our languages, and it's from that that you get this word barbarian. Remember that in the Middle Ages, Muslims will call Christians infidels, and Christians will call Muslims infidels, and both of them will call Jews infidels. And so a barbarian depends on where you stand, but because it's a word that everybody uses, I'm going to use it. So we have these tribes of non-Romans along the Rhine-Danube border on the eastern portion of the border who were interested in coming into the Roman Empire. Now, two things are going on there. One is that the center of Rome, remember they have had some lousy emperors, is starting to quiver a little bit. And what happens to the Roman Empire is hypothermia. So you don't want to live without your fingers or your toes, your hands or your feet. But actually you could survive. What you can't live without is your brain stem, your spine, and your inner organs, your heart and your lungs and all of the major organs. So if you are suffering from hypothermia, what the brain does is it retreats. It pulls blood from that which it can sacrifice, your extremities, to your trunk of your body, which it cannot sacrifice. And that's what the Roman Empire does. And so what happens is Roman armies begin to pull back, and the non-Romans on the other side of those borders begin to move forward and move forward and move forward. Some people say, well, this is a sign that the Roman Empire was collapsing. Well, it's a sign that the Roman Empire was contracting, but who runs into a burning building? Nobody. So obviously there were good things there that those barbarians wanted: fertile land, good systems, and they begin to adapt those systems. And of course, they probably had been in contact with each other earlier in these groups of people called the Federati, or the treaty peoples. You would pay the barbarians off so that they wouldn't invade you, but that put you automatically into an economic and probably cultural exchange with these people. So in the year 376, because they're being pushed from the east, the Goths are allowed to cross the Danube, and it's actually a controlled measure. They're bringing people in, they're putting them in what we would call refugee camps, they're giving them food and money, and they're writing down their names and things like that. But that trickle becomes a flood. It becomes so uncontrolled, the Goths begin moving in such huge numbers that the emperor himself, whose name was Valens, V-A-L-E-N-S, has to go up and defend. And in 378, he is killed at a battle called Adrianople, and people begin to say, okay, here's a turning point. In fact, because the defenses are contracting and those barbarians are moving forward more and more, the Visigoths sack the city of Rome in 410, an event that just made people think that the world must be ending. And in fact, Augustine of Hippo, remember Augustine who studied under Ambrose of Milan? Now he's a Christian, and now he's a bishop in a place called Hippo in modern-day North Africa. I think it's in Algeria. And he begins to write his great book, The City of God, where he talks about the city of God and the city of man. And most people think that the city of God is heaven and the city of man is earth. It's not. What he says, the city of God is the city of virtue, that you must live within the context of the city of man. And one of the things he's talking about is disorder. The disorder occasioned by the sack of the city of Rome. So Augustine has to ask, this empire, which has existed now for over 400 years, but a republic for 500 years before that, and a monarchy for 250 years before that, which nobody thought would ever end, what if it's about to end? What does that mean? And if that fall of the Visigoths in 410 weren't bad enough, the Vandals sack Rome in 445. That one's a little bit more controlled. A pope by the name of Leo sallies forth and basically bribes people to skirt the city. They kind of burn the outskirts, so we say that they did sack the area of Rome. The interesting thing there is that an emperor didn't ride out to negotiate with the leader the Bishop of Rome did, which tells us who is becoming powerful, because when Constantine goes off to Constantinople, there is an emperor, but a very weak emperor in the West. It's the Bishop of Rome, now endowed with money, who is now not only a religious leader, but a civil, secular, if you can, political leader as well. And in this case, kind of a military leader, because he's the one who's bribing this military force to go away. And then finally, historians like bookends, and they like things nice and neat. At least older generations of historians in the 1700s and the 1800s. And one of them discovered that there was an emperor on the throne in the year 476 named Romulus. Wait a second. Romulus and Remus, 753 BC, the twins abandoned by Mars and the shepherdess found by the she-wolf. So Romulus, that's his birth name, who has the title Augustus, the head of the emperor, is deposed in the year 476 by another marauding army of barbarians. And there it is. There's the bookends. There we go. There's the music. 753 BCE to 476 CE or AD. That's the end of the Roman Empire. I'm going to argue that Rome transforms in a moment, but that's why the date 476 is going around. Now, Christianity at this point is heading north. It's got money. It's got protection. And Europe is great territory to spread the faith. And a big turn comes when a leader by the name of Clovis in the area of Roman Gaul, modern-day France, converts in the year 503, brings lots of people with him to convert. Usually the women are converted first. They convert their husbands, and then the people underneath Clovis convert. Whether they really believed or not, we don't know. But that also allowed that turf to be nice and open, and Clovis himself sees himself as a defender and protector of the faith and endows local bishops. And Charlemagne, as we said in the prior topic, finds himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Finds himself, well, he says he found himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. He writes, "If I had known that the Pope was going to crown me Holy Roman Emperor, I would never have gone to Mass in his own chapel on Christmas Day." Ha, ha, ha. Isn't it funny that he had imperial garments already set out in his size? I wonder how that worked out. So I don't really believe Charlemagne there. He declares the Renovatio Romani Imperii, the renewal of the Roman Empire. Now check the date. It's Christmas Day 800. Didn't Rome fall 476, over 300 years before? So you could see that Rome is an idea that hasn't gone away even over 300 years later after its supposed fall. In fact, different people will claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor, not only throughout the Middle Ages, but until Napoleon's time, about 1800. And of course, there's a long legacy of sacred kingship, what older textbooks called sacral kingship. It actually goes back to pagan roots. It goes back to Mesopotamia, where Cyrus or Darius or Alexander the Great believed that they were favored by Ahura Mazda, the head of that belief system, and that Alexander the Great was the son of gods, and that he was the son of Amun-Re. So, I tell my students that when you look back at history from the longest view possible, theocracy, theocratic monarchy, is actually the standard form of religion in one way or another. It doesn't mean it should or shouldn't be nowadays, but that was the standard. And so this long legacy of sacred kingship leads rulers like Charlemagne to say that they are legitimately religious rulers. Remember I said in a prior topic that Charlemagne calls himself the 13th apostle, priest and king, rector of the true religion, vicar of Christ. Boy, does that strike modern ears as odd, but no, he says, I am the vicar of Christ. The Pope might be the vicar of St. Peter, but I am the vicar of Christ. And this leads to the medieval investiture controversies as to who, in fact, is in charge of medieval Christianity. Is it the person with the spiritual power, the Pope, or is it the person with the political power? Sometimes the Pope, but often the Holy Roman Emperor. And can a Pope depose an emperor if that emperor isn't up to snuff, if he is acting in an amoral or an immoral way? Or can he just say that? Can he just say that the king or emperor is immoral when he's really disagreeing? What if It turns out, as was sometimes the case, I'm thinking of a Holy Roman Emperor by the name of Henry III in the middle of the 11th century, what my students call the 1000s. What if Henry III is a better man than the Bishop of Rome? Can he depose the Pope? And in fact, he does. So you could see that this is very complicated. And now we have a new player on the scene as well. Not long after the fall of the Roman Empire, if you call it a fall and you date it to 476, Muhammad's born. We think Muhammad was born about 570. We're not quite sure. We know he receives the first revelation at about 610. And he goes from Mecca to Medina in 622, year 1 of the Muslim calendar. He dies in 632, and from 632 to 732, you can't make this up, Islam advances in 100 years, and it takes out what had been the eastern part of the Roman Empire up to the gates of Constantinople, all of North Africa, what would be the southern part of the old Roman Empire, and the Iberian Peninsula, what would be the western part of the Roman Empire, up, crosses the Pyrenees, gets up into Gaul, where they are pushed back by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers or Tours. So now Christianity and Rome's heritage are firmly in Europe and Latin and distance from its Eastern Greek roots. Which brings us to the question of, did Rome fall? Well, there are many theories, and I am going to narrow them down and group them together into several famous rubrics. One, and I think this one makes some sense, the empire got just too darn big. It got too big geographically, too many people, its military and its administration planned by Augustus, working very well, reorganized by Hadrian with the 6 imperial headquarters, by this time had become overextended. And you can say that it had simply run its course. I mean, 500 years is a pretty good run. We are only, as Americans, halfway through that, and I hope we continue. Will we go beyond that? Who knows? In other words, did the Roman Empire run its natural course? Did it have a natural evolution of a rise, a peak, and then a flow away? Then there's a moral explanation. This is the one that, it goes back to the notion of the first century emperors as the pornographic emperors. Was it all bread in circuses? Did they become totally decadent and immoral? Did Rome rot within? Was there lead in the pipes of the water and the wine that they drank? Did Rome become dumb, fat, and lazy? And this is often linked to that it was the Christians' fault, that it was Christian pacifism, and Christianity in its earliest forms have a very strong pacifist tendency, though we are going to see Christianity and violence linked together in medieval history, other religions as well, and so I would invite you to study the Crusades, that it was Christianity that made Rome weak. And Machiavelli is one of the first people who says this in the Renaissance, and then Gibbon. Gibbon is a very interesting character. He writes a very influential work called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He publishes this in 1776. He's British. He should know about empires falling at that point because he's a member of the British Empire in the same year that the Declaration of Independence is written. And Gibbon, who was fully a member of the Renaissance and really anti-religious and specifically anti-Christian, looks at the Christian Middle Ages and he refers to Christianity as monkish superstition. And he says, it's all Christianity's fault. Christianity drew the elites like Ambrose, like Augustine, to the clergy. If all of those men had just gone into the imperial administration, they were late Roman men, they were well trained. If they had just done that, the empire would have existed. The problem with that argument is that the empire survives in the Christian East. And the empire survives in the Christian East with the elites going into imperial administration, and the Christian East does so well, in fact, that there's an emperor named Justinian in the middle of the 500s who goes not west to east, but east to west, and reconquers, if you will, or re-solidifies an empire that includes Sicily, southern Italy, and North Italy, and he's got a little mini capital in Ravenna. It doesn't last a long period of time. So it doesn't quite work. And the other way of knocking down the moral explanation is that every society, now and then, looks back at past societies and says, oh, the good old days. Today, nothing as good as the good old days. Well, we find that in the late Republic, that is, in the late BCE years, writers like Sallust and Livy, pre-Christian writers, are complaining about immorality and bread in circuses and Rome rotting within and Rome becoming dumb, fat, and lazy because it's not the good old days of when we were fighting the Carthaginians and that's when we were tough. So that explanation really doesn't really work for me. There are economic and agricultural factors as well. We have, thanks to the study of people called paleoclimatologists who can go back and study tree rings and things like that, and they can tell us when there were good harvests and when there were bad harvests. What we find in the 300s and into the 400s is a series of years of bad climates. Bad climates, bad harvests. Bad harvests, bad nutrition. Bad nutrition, demographics dive. Bad crops, fewer Romans. Fewer Romans, I need more taxes and farmers, so I'll let the barbarians in. Do you remember Caracalla watering down citizenship as he is charged with so that he could have more soldiers and more tax dollars coming in? And that's the beginning of the end for that argument. And I think there's something to that part of the argument. Others will say that assimilation or accommodation or enculturation went too far. And I should say that nowadays, in the last, say, 15 years, since about the mid-1990s on, and I would say that this is going to go on for another 10 years, there's been a whole cottage industry of people using the fall of the Roman Empire or the so-called fall of the Roman Empire as a political metaphor for the United States. So, for instance, you will see books written and political speeches given where the modern immigration situation in the United States is measured up against assimilation and enculturation and immigration in the end of the Roman Empire by both the left and the right to make particular political points. And one of these points is that Rome should not have assimilated or accommodated or enculturated because it watered Roman citizenship down too much, that the military, who were encouraged to marry locally and to settle locally, ended up being loyal to the periphery. You may have heard the expression, we have met the enemy, they are ours. This is a version of that. We have met the enemy, we are theirs. We capitulated too much. The barbarians are inside the gates. When you mixed the races, you watered Roman blood down. My own feeling is that I think that the empire did get too big. I think that there were economic and agricultural issues which led to bad climates and demographic problems. But ultimately, I put myself in a school that says Rome didn't fall, that it just transformed and evolved. And this school of thought has been followed by and led by a number of people, but one of the most interesting ones is Peter Brown. A number of people know Peter Brown, Princeton historian, as the author of the biography of Augustine of Hippo, but he's also involved in what has become the late antique school of thinking. Now, when you think of antiques, you think of the Antique Roadshow. Antique meaning another word for the late ancient world, the 300s, 400s, 500s. And this late antique school looks at the period of about 150 to about 850, and they don't see what Gibbon saw, what Machiavelli saw. They don't see sudden catastrophic crisis, decline, decay. They don't use words like that. What they see is a synthetic, organic, natural rise and fall. And so they use words like transition, evolution, integration. And what they notice is when you look at the Middle Ages, there's so much Roman, well, fill in the blank. Poetry, prose, history, architecture, law codes. The church's law code, canon law, is based on Roman law. Art and architecture, thinking, philosophy, and theology as well. What they see is Rome's legacy in the Middle Ages, so that Rome for them never died but was transformed. So what is Rome's legacy in the Middle Ages? For that, you'll have to take another course.